October 20th, 1774, the First Continental Congress adopted something called the Continental Association, which called for a full-scale boycott of the British. It's actually considered the first of our four major founding documents, along with the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution for the United States. So this is something they don't really teach about in the school. So on this episode, I'm going to give you an overview of what it's all about. And I think there's plenty of strategy advice for how to deal with the largest government in history yet again today. But first of all, before getting to that, a quick hello and a huge thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one, I can't thank you enough. But since it's Fast Friday, I promise not to take up too much of your time. Let's see if I can get this info out to you in the next, say 15 minutes or so. I should mention that if you want to follow along with the articles and source documents that I'm going to be mentioning in this episode, you definitely want to follow us over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. There you're going to find all the archives of the show. And for each individual episode, I publish a blog post about 1 to 2 hours after the live stream is done, and you'll find all the reference links in a links section for each post. Anyways, let's get right to it and hear from an article we published by Mike Meharry just yesterday. Today in history, or yesterday in history, on October 20th, 1774, the First Continental Congress adopted the Continental Association. Some people call it just the Association. This agreement, Mike writes, put teeth into the Declaration of Colonial Rights the Congress adopted a week earlier by formalizing a coordinated economic embargo on British goods. And Mike's referring to the Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress, which he wrote about separately, and I did an episode fully just on that one particular document a couple of years ago. And here's from the description. That I called it an early Bill of Rights in the title. It not only set the stage for further actions in the next 2 years from 1774 going forward, but also included principles and rights that can be found in the Constitution and Bill of Rights ratified years later. I will link to that episode in the show notes so you can check that out on your own time. Here's back to Mike's article. He said, the association was the third significant step taken by the Continental Congress in response to the Coercive Acts, which were a series of laws passed by Parliament in early 74 to punish the colonies, primarily Massachusetts, after the Boston Tea Party. It represented one of the first formal shows of unity among the colonies. So this is basically a coordinated, united set of colonies taking a united action against the British. And here I've got an image of it that I think is really interesting. This is, I believe this image is from Thomas Jefferson's library. He wasn't yet a delegate to the Continental Congress, but he actually personally signed it. I don't know if you can see it in the bottom corner here. No, I can't scroll it up, but I will include a link to it so you can see that if you'd like to. On the bottom left-hand corner of it, he's actually signed it along with a handful of other people from Virginia, and some of the people who were delegates to the First Continental Congress that did sign this. For example, there's Richard Henry Lee, who actually was the person who suggested the approach. It was based on something done in 1769 in Virginia in response to the hated Townshend Acts called the Virginia Association, so there's a lot of similarities. There are also people like George Washington, Christopher Gadsden, John Dickinson, Patrick Henry, John Adams, Samuel Adams, John Jay, and Roger Sherman. Roger Sherman is the only person in history to have signed all four of these original founding documents, the Association, the Declaration, the Articles, and the Constitution. There are a bunch of other people who did sign as well. Anyways, back to Mike's article, if I can figure out how to pull this up. He said, local committees of correspondence kicked off resistance by passing resolutions opposing the Coercive Acts. And so this happened on a local level, primarily around Massachusetts. The best known was the Suffolk Resolves. And I think the Suffolk Resolves is something that we really need to pay a lot of attention to. It was adopted on September 9th by delegates at the Suffolk County, Massachusetts Convention of the Committees of Correspondence. That included Boston. And before that one actually came out, Samuel Adams and Dr. Joseph Warren drafted the Solemn League and Covenant. And this is from drjosephwarren.com. It was the first concerted response to the Boston Port Act, specifically closing the port. Adams and Warren are believed to be the architects and authors of this document issued by the Boston Committee of Correspondence. I think this was in June of 1774 and distributed throughout the towns in Massachusetts. It's a more forceful non-consumption and non-importation agreement than any preceding it. So this was passed by a couple of towns, and they were saying, we're not going to consume your products. We are going to starve the beast and get you to come to your knees. That was the goal in that type of a response. But many of the other towns, they weren't really on board. Well, they were, but they just wanted a more coordinated action. And they got a little bit more of that with the Suffolk Resolves, which I covered in another episode just a little over a month ago, September of 2022. Blueprint for Liberty, the Suffolk Resolves of 1774. It called for noncompliance to the Coercive Act. So many of the things that we use in our strategy against unconstitutional usurpations of power by the federal government, we should just look to what the founders and the old revolutionaries did. And specifically, the Suffolk Resolves called for noncompliance. Don't comply. If they're not authorized to pass it, you're not bound to obey them in the first place. So noncompliance with the coercive acts, disobedience specifically to the courts, and then they were way more aggressive than anything we do, at least at this point. Tax resistance, calling on sheriffs to refuse to enforce things, all kinds of stuff. Now, the day after, maybe it was the day after or 2 days after it was passed, Paul Revere, actually in one of his lesser-known rides, he brought them to Philadelphia. And the day after he arrived, the Continental Congress unanimously endorsed them, including all the principles in there, including the tax resistance, the noncompliance, and the like. Anyways, Mike goes on in his article. He says, the Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress laid out colonial objections to the coercive acts, listed their grievances. So this is a precursor to the Declaration of Independence, if you talk about listing out the grievances, and then outlined a list of colonial rights. The document set the stage for further action resisting the British, not just begging them to stop, but specifically resisting them, by expressing that the colonists resolve, quote, to enter into a non-importation, non-consumption, and non-exportation agreement or association. And then on October 20th, the Continental Association put that boycott resolution into effect, establishing a formal agreement between the 12 colonies represented in the Congress. Georgia did not send delegates. They eventually got on board sometime in 1775, and they joined in on that as well. Mike goes further. The document went on to establish a series of economic sanctions against the British. These are acts of war. So this is really, even though we often think of the shot heard around the world, Lexington and Concord in 1775, these are definitely acts of real conflict here. So economic sanctions against the British, including an immediate ban on the importation of British tea. And then beginning on December 1st, my birthday, the colonies agreed to stop importing or consuming any goods, not just tea, but anything from Great Britain, Ireland, or the British West Indies. Quote, we will not import into British America from Great Britain or Ireland any goods, wares, or merchandise whatsoever, or from any other place any such goods, wares, or merchandise as shall have been exported from Great Britain or Ireland. And they're just saying, no, we need to just stop engaging with you financially if you're going to continue to treat us, well, in ways that you shouldn't. Here from Resolve number 5, I guess paragraph number 5, resolution number 5, I'm not sure how to list these. If any merchant residing in Great Britain or Ireland shall directly or indirectly ship any goods, wares, or merchandise for America in order to break the said non-importation agreement, or in any manner contravene the same, on such unworthy conduct being well attested, it ought to be made public. So they wanted to publicly shame the people who were on the side of the empire. They're not talking about cowering in fear and hiding their views. They want to make it clear who the opposition is, who are the bad guys. And it's the bad guys are the ones who are helping the empire violate liberty. And they go on, they said, and on the same being so done, we will not from thenceforth have any commercial connection with such merchant. So this is kind of early on American Revolution, pro-liberty, anti-empire, cancel culture in a way, really. There's this saying, look, if you're going to do business with the bad guys, no one here is going to do business with you. We are going to make your name public. We're going to show exactly what's happening. And we're going to include our sanctions against you. But going further, they established committees to monitor things. So they started establishing kind of a outside the official system governance as well. Here's from number 11. A committee be chosen in every county, city, and town by those who are qualified to vote for representatives in the legislature, whose business it shall be to attentively to observe the conduct of all persons touching this association. And whenever a majority of that committee determine that someone is being problematic, any person within the limits of their appointment that has violated this association, that such majority do forthwith cause the truth of the case to be published in the Gazette. Again, shining a public light on the people taking the wrong side was an important part of their strategy at that point. And I think we need to start thinking about that type of approach today as well. And to that end, they said that all such foes to the rights of British America may be publicly known and universally contemned, so scorned or treated with contempt, as the enemies of American liberty. And thenceforth, we respectively will break off all dealings with him or her. So it's not limited by gender in that one either. Now, interestingly enough, right in clause number 2, they actually have a total ban on the slave trade as well. And that is a pretty big deal. A lot of people ignore that, and I'm going to point out an article that I think you should read regarding that specific clause, that specific ban here in just a moment. But they say, we will neither, this is before even talking about non-importation and non-consumption and what they want to follow up with in 1775 as well. But they say, we will neither import nor purchase any slave imported after the first day of December next. Again, December 1st, my birthday, after which time we will wholly discontinue the slave trade and will be neither concerned in it ourselves, nor will we hire our vessels, nor sell our commodities or manufactures to those who are concerned in it. They thought that would also strike a blow. Hear from Christian McBurney over at All Things Liberty, the Journal of the American Revolution, something I read all the time. It is a great resource. And he thinks this is astounding that they actually passed this. It was at the top. It was a big deal that they would have this type of ban in October of 1774. He says, perhaps equally astounding, Americans largely complied, turning the pledge into an outright ban on the slave trade. Congress's ban and widespread compliance with it during the Revolutionary War years has been underappreciated even by historians of the American anti-slavery movement. It should not be. He thinks this is a big deal. And the title of the article is "The First Efforts to Limit the African Slave Trade Arise in the American Revolution. Congress bans the African slave trade." So even if, and he's suggesting throughout this article, and I'm not really going to go through any details here, but the overall message is, some people were doing it just as a tool to economically punish the British, and other people were doing it because they were morally opposed to the slave trade, and this was a great opportunity to push that forward. You even got people who years later would have been absolutely opposed to banning the trade. At that point, they were on board, and that's a foot in the door. Every small step is a positive one, and I think this is a great article for you guys to check out if you want to read on your own time. Of course, that will be linked to in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And the effects from historian T.H. Breen points out that the restrictions in general, not just on the slavery, but on everything, were dutifully enforced, and trade with Britain plummeted. Breen states that by early 1775, the local committees of safety, quote, increasingly functioned as a revolutionary government, and British officials no longer were in control. So this is establishing basically a replacement. Now, Mike points out that the adoption of the association was a significant step in colonial resistance to Parliament. It demonstrated the colonies willingness and ability to work together in a coordinated way. It also drew a concrete line in the sand, Mike writes, letting the British know that the colonies were not just going to protest. It wasn't just talk. They were going to take action, even though there was a lot of talk. But this is a time to move forward. They were willing. I'm scrolling all over the place. What am I doing here? They were willing to take concrete actions to resist unconstitutional and tyrannical actions. And this was really just the starting point. They also included a clause in there that they threatened to ramp it up by September of 1775. If they did not repeal the coercive acts, they were going to also ramp it up with an export ban. But they said they didn't want to harm their fellow men and women overseas with that right away, but they'd have no choice if they couldn't get the coercive acts repealed. Now, we know that Lexington and Concord in April of 1775 certainly changed that trajectory, but this is the strategy that they used at that point. I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. This is not something that most of us have never heard of these things unless we're going out and trying to learn it. I know I'm trying to learn more about this even as I'm doing this episode with you. As I do the research, I try to learn more and more. There's so much that we can take from the founders and old revolutionaries and use in various ways today. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned something. I hope you have an awesome weekend. Of course, if you want to support us getting this kind of message out, these founding principles out to more and more people, nothing helps us get that job done more than the financial faith and support of our members. And you can join us today for as little as $2 a month. We will take that dirty government paper fiat and use it as a tool to fight for the Constitution and liberty, no matter whether they want us to or not. So we're going to continue doing that, and your support would be greatly appreciated over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, thank you so much for spending some of your time with me today. I hope you have an awesome weekend, and I'll see you next week here on the path to liberty.